All right. Let's get going. Our guest today is Anup Desai, who is a lawyer but part of the business affairs group at EA. And he is quite awesome. And I've seen his slides, and I think you'll enjoy it quite a bit. So I've got a lot of updates and a lot of previews this week, but and they cover a lot of different things. But I want to go back a couple of weeks, and you'll remember the argument where I suggested that maybe the Statute of Anne, which was the founding statute in relation to copyright, should be seen as part of the trajectory of freedom of expression that allowed authors finally to have control over their work. Found a really interesting fact. And of course, no facts are incontrovertible, and all facts are subject to interpretation. And of course, the right of free expression was not invented in relation to the French Revolution. It came out before that, a long time before that. But if you put free speech in the context of Greece or Rome, it's a very restricted version of free speech related to privilege, not to equality. And actually, that will tie into something that I want to show you at the end of the class. But if you're willing to go with my notion that copyright is perhaps should be seen as part of the trajectory of free expression, it's kind of interesting that the Statute of Anne was 1710, and the first really clear, pervasive, egalitarian statement of free expression, as near as I can tell, was 1793 in the second version of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The first version, 1789, is equivocal. It's sort of a very interesting turning point, and I may have enough time to talk about it in a different context at the end of the class. But it does add a little bit more fuel to my argument that I haven't heard others cite, that at least in 1710, free speech to authors was copyright. And then when notions of free speech became popularized, copyright had to be infused with other meanings. Nature abhors, or academia abhors, a vacuum of meaning. So tending towards property was perhaps a logical way to go. Okay, second update, and I have to go easy on Rock because he's not here to defend himself, and I made this point last week, but I couldn't resist fleshing it out. It's the Switzerland point that, I cited the Nordic countries as being arguably the appropriate combination of civil society values, soft IP, which helped them succeed in the creative industries, and very successful economies, arguably fueled by IP laws that understood creativity. And Rock came back and said, no, Switzerland is last year the top economy in the world. Explain that. And he cited, this was his slide, Switzerland has strong intellectual property protections. So Switzerland is not really a country whose industries are fueled by creative content. Their main industries are machinery, chemicals, watches, textiles, precision instruments, meaning watches, tourism, banking, and insurance. Yes, extremely strong economy, but not a lot of Swiss filmmakers are breaking into our movie theaters. Not a lot of Swiss games are what we're playing. A little more philosophically, I just want to point out that this is a really interesting article, which I don't expect you to go to because it's kind of the standard super academic back and forth that's very interesting if you're interested in it, and extremely draining and boring if you're not interested in it. I am interested in it, but this is a back and forth between two professors, Blankfein, Tebechnik, and Mergis. Sort of, they've both written articles on each other's stuff. It started with an article by Mergis, and Blankfein wrote one back, and then this is, I cite Mergis's reply, and because it's the third one in the series, and it gives you a perspective on all the arguments. So what I want to point out is Mergis's core argument is that utilitarianism has always been the core supportive doctrine, philosophically, of IP regimes. And Mergis's article was to poke holes in whether that was correct. And all I want to do is point out that Rock's arguments are very utilitarian, and appropriately so, but they're really based on, well, we need to move economics and commerce forward, and IP is a good way of doing that. And when you, and that may be true, but it's simply kind of gears in gears. It doesn't mean those are the appropriate principles. It means that those are the principles that yield the economic results that you argue for. In a different economic system, you would argue a different way. So I think that's a weakness in the standard IP canon. Please.
This actually goes back to what you were saying a little bit before, but sorry. You stated that, you posed the question, does Switzerland, with its strong IP, have all these cultural creations and creative industries that are now being influenced and imported into North America? To which you said no.
Or even domestically.
Okay.
So, I mean, I don't know enough, but I know people who've lived there, and there's no suggestion that I've heard. Yeah.
So what about the countries with really weak IP? Do they have a much significantly stronger creative industry than Switzerland?
First of all,
I definitely don't think that Russian and Brazilian art and film is being imported into North America.
No, but I don't think there's much argument that, well, I shouldn't, I'm not a cultural expert, so let me be really careful about this. It seems to me that Russia does have a creative community, is making films, is making music. Some of the musicians are ending up in jail. I hate to cite that as a good sign, but in a strange way it is. I missed yesterday. I'll send you to the Berkman Center. There was a piece, yesterday's luncheon talk, which I missed and will have to pick up on the web, so I haven't even caught up to it, was on the Nigerian film industry. Now, I don't know how strong IP laws are in Nigeria, but I suspect that they're not that strong. And if somebody's at Harvard giving a talk on the vitality of the Nigerian film industry, that must be interesting. These are anecdotal. So, what it needs is serious academic study. And remember, all of this started with a librarian at Rutgers Law School who noticed a parallel. Countries with weak IP had strong economies. That's where this started. This requires real study, not, it's fine for a video game law course, and for this course, to yak about it and say, hey, this might be an interesting indicator of something, but it requires a lot more than what we're capable of. Would make a fantastic paper if somebody wants to go there and could find enough legal connection in terms of incentives or otherwise to make it fly as a legal paper. Then I just want to cite on the other side, because Rock's criticism of my saying, IP doesn't live well as property because you can slice and dice IP much more easily than property. His point's entirely well taken there. And there's a good piece in the Journal of Competition Law and Economics, which you can link to, that I think pretty well entirely supports his position. Third update, this just came out, or just kind of made it into consciousness. It actually came out September 23rd, so it's about a month old. It is a month old. And this is another Blizzard case. And it's another bots case. And it was a motion for summary judgment against the bot maker, which the court allowed, based on, among other things, but very significantly, the World of Warcraft terms of use and end-user license agreement. So nothing new here, but kind of one more Blizzard case. I think we're now up to 5 or 6.
This one is pretty interesting as well, because they were actually, it was found that they have to pay $7 million.
Yes.
Blizzard, and so they've actually started a donation fund, and they're trying to reach out to the botting community, saying, hey, you guys used our bots and enjoyed our services, and call you out and help us with our legal fund. And they only grossed about $300,000 in revenue, and had about 2,000 users, and yet I'm not sure how they came up with quantum damages, but $7 million is pretty, it's definitely some sort of exemplary damage there. But yeah, the fact that they're going out and they're asking people to pay their fines, pretty outrageous, and everyone's really about it.
Well, it's interesting, philosophically, if they were like BNETD, which didn't charge for its matchmaking service, and it was just a community group that was sort of, retrofitting what Blizzard had done and tried to make it work better, I suspect the community would be much more generous. In something like this, where they were selling a utility, which is what it was, I can see someone saying, "Well, you're sort of charging me, you're charging me twice." Interesting point. Trying to raise $7 million from the community in a sort of protest gesture, that's a lot of money.
And these guys even charged a monthly fee, so I think it was $20 something to start, and then $9 a month.
Oh, so it was.
So I guess that was somewhat of an anti-piracy circumvention measure, so I find it kind of ironic.
Yeah, $100 a year or more. That's a lot of money. Okay, so those are the updates. I just go on the assumption that you guys aren't reading the syllabus on a regular basis. So we're through creating, and we are just about through connecting. And the question that we have, or I want to remind you of after the 10 cases exercise from last week, is, are we in a post-IP world dominated by contract where copyright law doesn't matter? That's kind of the overly simplistic core concept that we're working on. And 2 weeks ago, we talked about digital resale. We talked about transferability by will. We're going to talk about some of these things again, but all of these things are contract related rather than IP statute related. And so just because I love matching up things in left and rights, creation goes to copyright law, connecting goes to contract law. And today, I call this a second stage assessment of the utility of end-user license agreements. Second stage because last year was the first stage. The name of the talk is What's It All About Beta. Last year it was What's It All About Alpha, which was meant to play on the song What's It All About Alfie. So it's getting pretty obscure when it turns into beta, but I couldn't really call it the same as I called it last year because this is the second kick at the cat, and it is somewhat different. So I want to focus you a little bit on two words, constrain and restrain, because they are different. Constraint and restraint. Constrain is about coercion, restricting scope, compelling action, shaping. Not necessarily forcing, but shaping the flow of something. And it can get, a little hard-edged. Synonyms are compel and coerce. But there's an interaction, not just a hard border. Restrain is prevent. Restrain is a border, a wall. It's not simply coercing, it's preventing, it's stopping. And its synonyms are repress and control, among others. So think of it as copyright law constrains creation, shapes it. And that's something I want to explore in a course next year called Legal Constraints on Digital Creativity. But it's a constraint. It shapes it. Contract law, as we saw last week, is in prohibitive language. It's at least overtly a restraint. And where this gets kind of interesting is that it really depends how you want to look at contracts and how you want to look at statutes philosophically. A restraint is far more hard-edged, and yet it appears most often in our context in what is supposedly a freely bargained contractual situation that's supposed to be mutual. So, I mean, a lot of this is about the anomaly of contract, but I want to point that out. Whereas copyright law is statutory, seems like it should be more important because it has the force of the state behind it. It comes out of statute. Yet it's, in this way, softer. And then when you add in fair use or fair dealing, and you add in what the Supreme Court of Canada has done, it starts getting much softer. So where's... So I want you to think about this in moral terms. Look at the indicators around end-user license agreements. The companies draft, we don't redraft. What's particularly interesting and ironic is that in the end-user license agreement in terms of service context, what are they selling us in the gaming context? They're selling us something that's interactive. And there is zero interactivity around the contractual process here. Yet everything that we're buying from them, or licensing from them, presumably we want it for its interactivity. That's certainly true of gaming for most of us. So so you can't say, gee, they don't have the capability to do it. They're building the software that does exactly that. But there is no interactivity in the contractual process. Now you can say, well, that's not practical. How can they do it? All good arguments. I simply want to point out the irony. And I think it's a deep irony. Because they can't say they don't know how to do interactivity, because that's exactly the products we're buying. The click-wrap fiction we've talked about more. We've talked about a lot. We'll talk about it more. And I just want to point out this, and we as lawyers are largely responsible for this, but not completely. And I'm not sure who takes all the responsibility for this, but there is definitely a lack of standardization around end-user license agreements in terms of service. They are all snowflakes. They are all somewhat different from each other. There isn't an industry association standard form. Here, we've, the Video Game Association, we've had a committee look at what are the appropriate balances for a consumer contract for a video game, and here they are. And yes, you can deviate from them, but the industry has spoken as to what is fair. That's not happened yet. I don't know why, and I'm not close enough to know why, but it is very odd. At least to me. And we're going to talk, this point, so point number 4 just goes to something is going to be the core of what I'm going to talk about today, which is, do we even need end-user license agreements? There's no question video game companies have vested interests in things that we all think they should be able to protect. I mean, they're games and game communities don't simply govern themselves. It's not utopia, as we know. And there are balances in games. And As we saw last week, we've had gamers sue bot companies, and arguably rightly so. You're ruining my game. So it's not quite so simple, but do we actually need contracts, which is a very extreme part of this. And then there are the moral questions of the uses of contracting out. And the most obvious one that we'll come back to, but let's state it right up front. In light of the Snowden revelations, and you probably all know this or suspect it, even though you haven't read the end user license agreements, that all of them say that the company can cooperate with law enforcement and that you waive any of your rights in that regard. And that may not have meant that much to any of us 6 months ago or a year ago. But ask yourself today about the morality of, in a click-wrap agreement, companies essentially forcing that concession out of you. And you've agreed to it 1,000 times over. 10,000 times over. Now, one other bit of self-criticism as lawyers. These agreements, end-user license agreements, terms of service, privacy agreements, have gotten longer and longer and longer. And we are imperfect as drafters. I just like this sign. This was in the interior when we were on our summer vacation. Okay, dogs on sidewalk only, so where do me and my family go? Drafting is an imperfect art. By necessity, not by design. There's an inherent ambiguity, so the longer these agreements get, the more confusing they get. And hopefully last week, as we went through some of the provisions, you saw there we go. You saw some of those problems. So there's a flow here. Copyright grants users' rights, contracts removes users' rights, and a question, will users' rights reemerge? So what the Supreme Court of Canada has done is fabulous, but it's within the context of copyright law. It's not within the context of contract law. And that's really important to remember. So we have now very powerful user rights. We are contracting out of them. Will they reemerge in some other form? And a couple of other anomalies. I've pointed out the first one here. The companies we're contracting with customize our content, and it's all about interactive content. Really, can they not do that with EULAs in terms of service and privacy agreements? And then another one where you have to work with the creative industries, and it will make you at least wonder how many of the companies that make you sign these contracts could actually live within the contracts they're making you sign. So, fair question back. But there's really bad stuff that happens. There's racism and sexism and threats of violence and things that happen in communities and virtual assaults and all sorts of really bad stuff that happens online, and especially in gaming communities populated by kids. And shouldn't the video game companies be able to deal with that? It's not an unreasonable thing for them to do. And sometimes they do have to step in. So wear your lawyer hats and ask yourself, can they do that without a contract? Can they do that through notice? Hey, if you're going to engage in, I just drafted this. This is my inadequate drafting. As a community notice, cheating, illegal, or intolerant behavior is not acceptable. In such event, in our sole discretion, we can kick you out of here. Do we seriously think a court's not going to enforce that? Do we seriously think that's inadequate in the circumstances that it would apply?
I don't think American courts would enforce it. I think Canadian courts would enforce it.
Okay. You may be right. There's certainly, I don't know enough about the difference. I suspect Canadian courts would enforce it, so we're in agreement there. I don't know enough about American jurisprudence on notice provisions. But it's quite clear that the American courts have allowed freedom of expression in terms of violence and in terms of other forms of communication that has greater latitude than we might tolerate here. And the Schwarzenegger case, which we'll talk about later on in the course, is an example of that. So, absolutely fair point. I also want to talk about sort of reversing, flipping what you just said on its head, a different result of all of this, and that is that end-user license agreements can be used to force you to contract out of what ordinarily you would consider to be your free speech rights. So, Apple rejects game based on Syrian civil war. Controversy. Should they be able to do that? Should they be able to do that because the terms of service and end-user license agreement for the App Store is what allows them to do that? Maybe they should be allowed to do that. But should it be something more than a simple contractual edict? Where does freedom of expression, where does the Charter, where does free speech in the First Amendment play into those things? And gather that Apple actually said this. If you want to criticize a religion, write a book.
But I don't really agree with what you're saying. I mean, by the way you're describing it, it's almost a right of somebody to be able to put a game on the Apple Store. Talking about what Rock was saying last week, Apple is the most valuable brand in the world. It's worth almost $100 billion. They have an interest in protecting that and regulating what they do. Just because somebody has a freedom of expression doesn't mean they can, stand on my lawn and shout out something.
Right.
Everybody has a right to control what goes on there. within the confines of their own operation.
I think that's absolutely correct. I also think it depends on the size of your lawn. Apple's got a very big lawn here. This is why we have antitrust law. But these are not simple answers, right? These are colliding values. But when your lawn is that big and you are the dominant player, then people's expression and their freedom to express themselves, and their freedom to express themselves politically, which we certainly in Canada have lots of constitutional statements around that being an even more, I don't know that I've ever bought this completely, but the courts have certainly said that's even a more core freedom of expression value, freedom of expression value in Canada. I don't buy it. I think I happen to think that all artistic expression is, in fact, all expression is political, and it's all on one plane. But the Supreme Court of Canada has, in earlier dicta, I think in the mid-90s, said, you know what, political expression is a core expressive value. So we're starting to play around with core values, whether we think they should be or not, and political expression, whether you think it should get more latitude than other expression, or just get a lot of latitude. Those are kind of the only two choices. So again, it's a direct collision with contract law. And should it be contract law, that's the hard restraint, not shaping constraint, but hardcore wall restraint. That's why I defined those words for you earlier. Okay. So now, just the core functional argument here. We went through 10 cases last week. And I'm just going to very quickly, over the course of the next 2 slides, take you through the 10 cases and point out to you that none of them, at the end of the day, had their result entirely reliant on contract law. Every one of them had multiple causes of action that were available. The DMCA in the Davidson case. In Game Dollar had other contractual claims, unfair competition claims, unjust enrichment claims. MDY had DMCA. Blizzard and Marshall had copyright infringement, DMCA. iRacing, there was a copyright infringement found. Zynga and Nebraska had trademark infringement, unfair competition, passing off. Evany and Holland, trademark and trade dress, tortious interference with contractual relations. And the other cases just were distinguishable in legal terms. You can visit them on your own. The point being, again, to my core challenge to you guys, do we need these massive end-user license agreements? Do we really need them? If you analyze the cases, you'll find plenty of evidence that the courts would have come or could have come to the same conclusions without those contracts.
I guess for the developer, though, it's not any more burdensome for them to throw it in once it's not buying their games, because that part is
It's not burdensome except for their legal fees. They know everyone's going to agree. It gives them an advantage. And the real issue is, well, there's a lot of real issues. I've tried to point out some of them. What if they're taking real rights away? What if they've bartered away your privacy? This is over stuff you haven't read, and that they know you haven't read, and you know you haven't read, and the courts know you haven't read. So my real argument is that the system is so strained as to be broken. And at what point are we going to, and are the courts going to deal with this? And I really believe they are. I think it's inevitable that they will. The fiction is simply too great. Continuing on the unfairness theme, this is just out of the World of Warcraft EULA. So again, remember, this is a licensing agreement, right? Not a sales agreement. So we've licensed you this. If you want to terminate this game and this license, you can. You've got to do a couple of things. You've got to destroy all copies of the game. You've got to remove the game from your hard drive. And you have to notify Blizzard of your intention to terminate this license agreement. I wonder how many notifications of intention to terminate Blizzard has received. Well, there were at some point 10 million World of Warcraft players. I'd love to know if they've got 10 of those. There's a lot of lawyers in the world. We don't like, as a general rule, having contracts hanging over our heads. We've accumulated, all of us in this room, thousands of contracts that we don't know the terms of, that are somewhere in our patrimony, that somehow are things we've agreed to and provisions we've agreed to that are out there. And if you bought World of Warcraft at some point and installed the hard disk, you're still liable for whatever is in those 20 pages of agreement. Maybe it's okay. Maybe it's all benign. Maybe it's not. A couple of more facts. The average privacy policy reading level is that of a college sophomore. The average US reading level is 8th grade. And then I'll send you this website. Terms of Service didn't read. There's a wonderful collection of really just interesting, fun stuff there. So when I went through this for the first time, I was like, God, how did we get here? And I literally pulled out my contract texts from law school from 1976, which is when I took contract law. And I thought that would be actually useful because it was pre-digital and in many ways, a little closer to the source. And looked at it for a couple of hours and sort of, this is stuff you're much closer to than I am. So I need not tell you this, but really the common law is concerned not with the presence of an inward and mental assent, but with its outward and visible signs. So because you've clicked I agree, that's good enough for the common law, no matter how big the fiction is. And I guess where I see this changing is that the fiction has now become so big, so hard to ignore, that I find it hard to believe that judges will indefinitely say, we know no one's reading this stuff. We know that there are incursions on civil rights here, and people are giving away liberties, sometimes small, sometimes a little larger, but it's okay because of the sanctity of contract. I just can't imagine that that will hold up. I don't know who the Lord Denning for this age will be, but somebody will come up with a theory, and someone will break through. I have to believe that. And this is just kind of the core argument that if these agreements all disappeared, there's lots of other law that would fill in the gaps and ensure that the world didn't fail and that makers of games and software were not left without the appropriate rights to govern themselves and their users. And the core of the argument, and I guess, yes, this is a bit of a polemic, is that end-user license agreements are unnecessary, and show me why they're necessary. And there's a good paper in that.
Well, I was just thinking, John, that maybe if the world, all of these EULAs and terms of service agreements disappeared right away, you would have things like copyright and privacy law and all these other things coming in. But in a case of fair dealing or fair use, aren't you better off just like going to Clio for your answer? Because nobody knows how those cases are decided until they come out. So I think that EULAs and terms of service, they take out the ambiguity, which is a noble thing that lawyers are trying to achieve in certain instances.
Well, I could see myself getting about 2/3 to your point, provided there was a standard form approved by an industry association that took into account consumer rights, rights of free expression, and a fair and democratic system. I mean, there needs to be kind of an all-in white paper study initiated by industry and government and consumer groups to decide what the standards should be. Where there's a deviation, the deviation should be marked in giant red letters and clearly explained. And I do think the system could work. But right now, there's no indication of any of that. There's just a continuation of the fiction. And when you look at Snowden, I mean, I think we're going to get a pretty big backlash from Snowden. I mean, I found myself yesterday when Apple announced, and I'm a MacBook user, when Apple announced that all the upgrades to the operating system for MacBooks were free and ubiquitous, I couldn't help myself. I was like, gee, I wonder if government wanted them to do that so that there was a more broad backdoor. I know that can't possibly be right. But the thought actually went through my brain. I dismissed it, but it still went through there. So I don't know that the current center can hold. And I'm not much of a grassy knoll conspiracy theory guy. So market uprising is what I think, we see elements of that. We saw, every time there's an update, Google a couple of weeks ago, you see signs that there is a consumer resentment that's coming closer and closer to the fore, and the fact that large software companies have cooperated with government to make data available about citizens, I think is going to accelerate this process. The other alternative that I think is going to come in is technology, and that's going to be more controlled by the licensors. So Sony hasn't implemented this. In fact, they've gone the opposite direction, which is why everybody wants a PS4. But they did develop an internet-free method for blocking used game sales. Interestingly, strategically for the PS4, they're going in exactly the opposite direction, and they really hurt Microsoft and the Xbox One by saying, no, we're not going to mess around with resale of games. And the Xbox One system, at least initially, looked like it would. And Microsoft had to backtrack. But the point being that technology can do all this without contract. And I think that may be where some of this does get resolved, because we buy the technology as is.
But technology just supersedes technology, because there were in the past, like on the PlayStation 1, you couldn't play burned discs and stuff like that.
Right.
But then you could chip the system and play the burned discs. It's only a matter of time before this would be.
Well, technologically it could be, but we do have in law, both in Canada and certainly with the DMCA in the United States, very specific provisions that say you can't do that. So right now, if you put something in the technology that prevents it, I'm not saying that you couldn't have an antitrust action that removes it, but the onus is much more on the consumers. I'd rather argue freedom of expression. I'd rather argue I don't want my privacy rights infringed than they've put in a system and I've circumvented it. In terms of what are my odds in front of a court. So what might the future bring? This never got passed, but I just want to point out, far too simplistic. But in California, a member of the state legislature tried to introduced a bill that said privacy policies cannot be longer than 100 words. And I really do believe that if industry doesn't get its act together with consumer groups and create standard form, comprehensible licensing agreements, the state will eventually do that. Probably aided and abetted by the courts. And kind of the next version of Denning saying, how could this be? Sweeping it aside, knowing that the industry will have to fix it. We've seen things like that in a constitutional context, a very different constitutional context, where the courts make a fairly radical decision, knowing that it'll get worked out. But if they don't make the decision, the status quo was not acceptable. So that's my guess about what will happen here. Lots and lots of further reading, lots of stuff on end-user license agreement and privacy agreements. Tons of stuff showing that nobody reads this stuff, which is really obvious. Sarah Grimes' article, and Sarah, as I think I mentioned, was a student in this course a few years before she wrote this paper, and now she's a professor at U of T. In the context of kids gaming, it's even a more interesting issue because kids can't agree to a contract per se. So, and kids are what, a third of the gaming population, probably shrinking in relative terms, but in absolute terms still probably growing. Lots and lots of stuff if you're interested in writing a paper. Greg Listoka just did a short piece on estate planning and digital assets. Well worth reading. And then just the latest on Google's new terms of service, if you're interested in that article. So I've talked quite a bit about the post-IP world. And the world that we're in is post-IP world A, which is contracts have superseded copyright law. And we are in a form of dystopia, whether Rock wants me to use that word or not. And then post-IP world B, which the Supreme Court of Canada is doing what they can to make happen, is a user rights world. But we don't yet have the standard formatted minimalist contracts. And I'd like to think that our Supreme Court of Canada, given the opportunity and given how well it would fit with a user's rights world, if the right case went up to them, would find a way. So call me an optimist. So next week, we go to the last piece of connecting, which is technology. So where are we going to talk about technology in a video game world? Well, it's in a video game law class. I'm going to be very brief, but I want to show you what I've been working on. And I don't know that this is right, but I've been working on it for a little while, and this is kind of my next serious, aside from the course I'm doing next year, this is kind of where I want to go in terms of my serious research in the future. I think there are these interesting, strange parallels, and I've put them all in my own words. And I need to do a lot of real historical research along both lines. One line is the history of technology, and the second line is the history of the meaning of the word justice. Not the philosophical meaning, not the jurisprudential meaning, but the popular, think of it as meme meaning of justice. And there are these very interesting parallels. So where I originally started was, gee, isn't it interesting that retribution, an eye for an eye in the Bible, was thought of as the prevailing meme of justice? And in today's world, an eye for an eye would not be justice, it would be injustice. We would say that's not justice. And we're very clear on that. So the meaning of justice has clearly changed. And as I guess because I'm interested in both subjects, I started going, gee, technology seems to have something to do with how our meanings change and get defined and redefined. And that's actually no surprise if you think about it deeply, that communications technologies do this. I don't know how that got to be 111. It was all, I had the numbers right. That's weird. It must have been kind of in a final version of it that it all changed back. That should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And where it kind of came together for me was under the printing press. Because we know that the printing press led fairly directly to Martin Luther and led over time to a very rights-based, equality-based meme of justice. And so I see these parallels of kind of pre-literate society, justice being retribution, you get writing instruments, and you start getting privilege. This is where I was talking about Rome and Greece, and yes, there was freedom of expression, but it was for the very few. You know, we defined justice based on privilege. And if you want to look for the vestiges of that, just look at defamation law. Defamation law is not about equality, it's about reputation. If you look at the damages, if you are a person of substance in society, you will get more damages than if you are somebody nobody knows of. There's very few vestiges left, but defamation law, if you're looking for the vestiges of privilege that still hold some sway in our law, you'll find some of them there. Then you get where we often think we are, which is this kind of rights-based, equality-based meme of justice that I'm suggesting came from or was facilitated by the technology of the printing press. Now we're in a digital world. I think the prevailing meme of justice today is dispute resolution. Aside from the fact that there's probably 10 courses in this school and in every law school about dispute resolution in one form or another, I think where we really are is we just want disputes to get resolved. And we see it as that justice is the dispute being resolved. Not just equality, but some form of resolution. And you can see that there's a variety of studies in terms of justice reform, and I think if you look at them, you might see that meme. And I just questioned, okay, so where are we going technologically? And I just pulled out what you could take immersion in 3D. There are other possibilities for the future. I'm guessing that the data cloud is really pervasive, and I'm going to suggest, based on that maybe a more individuated form of justice will then be the next beam into the future. We're nowhere near there now. But my point when we look at technology, and this is how I try desperately to make it relevant to this course, is when we look at video game technology, we are actually looking at not only problems the law is going to have to solve, but quite possibly things that will influence what the law is going to be. Anyways, wrong numbering aside, if anybody has any ideas on any of this, I'd be deeply grateful, because I'm really just starting into serious research on it. And then kind of on a lighter note, when we're talking about technology, although I want to be careful when I say it's light, because in a weird way it's not light at all, there's this wonderful article that I commend to you by Nick Bostrom of Oxford, which argues that there is a very, very good chance, like 50 to 75%, that we are in fact living in the computer simulation of a future generation. And that what's happened is that technology has proceeded unabated, and we are some variation of The Sims. And he argues very persuasively and very seriously that if we had that technology available to us, just like we have our fish and our hamsters, and that we would no doubt create our own pet worlds, and that if we haven't destroyed ourselves in the future, there's a pretty decent chance that we are somebody's pet world. And that's it. So Anoop is here, and we will switch over to him and to his presentation. So give us 5 minutes. Today I'm giving a talk for Open UBC Week at 1 o'clock, but I should still be back for office hours at 2:30 as scheduled, if anybody wants to come by. But if I'm 5 minutes late, at least you'll know why.